And we're just starting out our May 1st lesson on JavaScript. And so you need to go onto Code Academy as always and log in, which I've already done. And then you want to click the Learn button to get to the lessons we're going to be working on. And scroll down to JavaScript. And the lessons that we are going to be doing today are right here. It's the for loops in JavaScript. And so this is going to be a great lesson. Again, things start to happen a little, you notice a little more rapid fire. And we have a nice exercise that you have to do at the end. So the exercise this time isn't quite as fun as your rock, paper, scissors game, but it's how to search for text, search a text for your name. So that's something that you've done in lots of programs before. So it's kind of interesting to maybe learn one way that happens. Loops are pretty complex, so this is a little bit of a confusing lesson, but it's very normal to be confused when you start to learn about loops. And it's, again, just sort of getting familiar. Our understanding of syntax is moving away from, excuse me, moving away from necessarily sort of memorizing things like French grammar and more into really understanding what it is, what are the logics that are constructing that grammar. So this is exactly where we want to be for this class, because it's when you start to understand the logics of computation that you can start to then identify how something like a piece of architecture could be playing in those logics as well. What kinds of what kinds of visual aesthetic implications might those have? And processing is another way to explore that as well in a more directly visual environment. But in that directly visual environment, you don't always quite get the structure. So this is sort of the primer for understanding that other mode of seeing all of these as well. In any case, so we just want to go into the introduction for loops. And we'll go to basics, and I have to reset my code here. Why do you use loops? We're learning how to program because we don't want to do boring, repetitive tasks. Remember that DRY principle. Do not repeat yourself. So we want the computer to do all that repetition. And so we're just going to learn kind of a very simple way to use loops here. So first step is to understand why we would use loops in the first place, and that is do console log 5 times basically to cause it to print out the numbers 1 through 5. So that's pretty easy. Console.log, print out 1, semicolon, right? Pretty simple. And because I know the computer enough, and you all should know this too, you can do cut, copy, cut, copy, paste. Make it a little bit easier on myself so I don't have to type console log all those times, and then I can just go through here and change what it is we're printing. Yeah, okay, there we go. Submit. Woohoo! Easy when we're in the beginning part of this. Okay, so our first for loop. So instead of manually typing console log 5 times, we can use a for loop to do this. The aim of this exercise is to show you how that for loop basically works. Subsequent exercises will walk you through the syntax bit by bit and explain how the computer thinks as it executes a for loop. We initially focus on using for loops just to count numbers to keep things simple, but by section 3 we'll show you how to do more fancy things. It's when we start sort of expounding on that is where for loops and really understanding the syntax of a for loop is important. So, instructions. The for loop in the code will print out 1 to 5 and use far less code than used in the previous exercise. Change the 6 to an 11 and press save to see the computer print out the numbers 1 through 10. So here's an example of a for loop, and let's take a look at it. So the first thing we have in a for loop is the idea that it would start with the word for. And then you notice that we have parentheses. Now if you think back to what other sort of commands have looked like this, if you remember, the other command that looks like this is sort of the if-else. Remember the syntax of an if-else was that you would have if, and then in parentheses you'd have what we called the conditional. then do the code in the curly braces. Well, you notice, in fact, we have a very similar structure here. These are the structures that are important because you start to see these repeating, right? So for conditional, do the code in the curly braces. So we know that we sort of have an idea of what that structure is, right? So what does the conditional look like? This is a big difference. Remember, the conditional previously was sort of if, A equals B, then do this, otherwise do something else. Here we have something very different going on. If variable var counter is equal to 1 is the first step, and then counter is less than 11, and then counter plus plus. That's pretty confusing, but we're just going to let it go because they explain it a little bit later. So we can see that there are these three sort of steps to the conditional though, yeah? And we can assume that there's something going on in that conditional that says something in the conditional, then do the loop. And then something probably is going to stop in the conditional and then stop doing the loop. And that's why it's called a for loop, okay? But we can see sort of those bits of it. So it says change the 6. I had to reset the code there. So originally it's set up to do something from 1 to 6, and we want to change it so that it does something from 1 to 11. So we'll just submit this code here, and it says, oops, because I didn't change anything. But you can see that that original code is set up to do what we asked the computer to do in the last lesson, type 1 to 5. But the instructions say change the 6 to 11. So we can do that. That's easy. And save and submit. And that is the second lesson in this 5-lesson set. And you notice that by changing it to 11, we got it to print the numbers 1 through 10. Okay, so congratulations, you've just run your first for loop. But what you're probably really keen to do is write your own. Below is the general syntax for a for loop, and we want to focus on the first line for a few exercises. So this is what we started to talk about already. So you have for, and then you have the parenthetical or the conditional, and you're saying some var, so you're declaring a variable, for variable I equal to 1, and then the next part is I is less than 11, and the next part I should equal I plus 1. For every loop every for loop, makes use of a counting variable. Here our variable is called I. We know it's called I because we've said call the counting variable I. But it can have any name. The variable has many roles. The first part of the for loop tells the computer to start with the value of 1 for I. It does this by declaring the variable, calling it I, and saying I equals 1. Remember, the computer reads things linearly. So I equals 1. When the for loop executes the code in the code block, so here, it does so starting off where I equals 1. So for variable I equals 1, then go do code, code, code. So let's look at our example here. The for loop starts out, reset code, sorry, there we go. The for loop starts out at 1 and will end at 10. Change the for loop so it starts off at 5. So that's easy enough. For variable I equals 1, and then we have something about here, I being less than 11, and then I equals I plus 1. So you can start to see what's happening. You can see that we're incrementing that I up by 1, and the code is telling you to print it. So the question is, can you guess what this code is going to do? And you should be able to do that pretty easily because we've actually seen the code execute before. But the instructions are to change it so that it will start off at the number 5. So everyone should have in mind what they want to do in order to make that happen. And that should look something like this. Yeah. So there you have printed out now the number starting at 5 rather than starting at 1. Okay. Going forward then, we'll reset that code. Okay, so now we know how to control for where the for loop starts. How do we control where it ends? That is the second part of the loop. So we have, remember, for, our counting variable is I equals 1. We know we start there, and we know we manipulate the start by changing that number, but where does it end? Here, this loop will keep running until I equals 10, i.e., where I is less than 11. Can you imagine a different conditional that you might put right here where you could just type the number 10? I think you probably can. So when I equals 2 or when I equals 9, the loop is going to run, but once I is no longer less than 11, the loop will start, right? And these loops go so fast because the computer is so fast, like much faster than you and I could say the numbers in sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The computer is much faster than that. So the instructions, we know this for loop counts from 1 to 10 because we've seen it happen. Change the loop such that it starts at 4. Think real quick how you're going to do that. And change the loop such that it counts up to and including 23. In other words, we do not want 24 to print out. So run your loop from 4 to 23. So the start is the easy part because it's a literal translation. Here we don't have less than or equals to, but we want it only to go to 23, so that's pretty easy. This we want to be, in fact, 24. And now this should print out from 4 to 23. And it does. Perfect. Okay. And then the final lesson is controlling the for loop. So now we can control where the for loop starts and ends. What about controlling what happens in between? In the examples we have looked at, we've used I equals I plus 1. And that is logically, there we go, that is logically the easiest sort of way to understand the code. But this has meant we've incremented or increased the variable I by 1 each time. So now we've just got some things we should memorize. First, a more efficient way to code the increment up by 1 is to write I plus plus. And that's just really a shortcut. It's like remembering control, copy, paste is equally done as control C and then control V. We can increment down by I minus minus. We can increment up by any value by writing I plus equals X, where X is how much we want to increment up by. So I plus equals 3 counts by 3s. And then logically you can imagine you can go down by the same value, I minus equals X. Be very careful with your syntax, however, because a loop that doesn't properly end is called an infinite loop and will crash your browser. So you can start to imagine what kinds of conditions would cause that to happen, and we've all had that happen to us before. So instructions. Currently, this code counts every numbers 1 through 35. Make it start counting from number 5. Easy enough. Remember how to do that? Yeah. Okay, to do that, we just make this 5. Stop the counting when it prints 50. So we have the less than, so we know to get 50, we have to go up to 51, and count only fifth number. And so instead of I plus plus, we want it to say I plus equals 5. So incrementing up by what? By equals 5. And then we're going to console log that. So really what's happening is it's saying, okay, variable I is 5. Is I less than 51? Yes. Do the loop. Come over here and do this code. And then go back to the loop because it's a for loop. So then it says, okay, I now is 5, but is I less than 51? Yes. Go up by 5. So then do it as 10. And on and on and on until it reaches this conditional saying is I less than 51. Eventually it's going to say yes because my I is 55, and that's going to stop the loop. Does that make sense? And so if we hit that, there we go, up to 50, and that is the end of the section. And the end of the basics section of for loops. So that's that. I'll see you for section 2 in the next video.